Oh, hi there. Welcome to the ASMR Library. I'm so glad that you decided to join us today. Now, I know that you wanted to come and talk to us today about a membership to the library and to get some inspiration in your reading. Here at the library, we do think that we have an excellent selection of stories and resources. Not everything is about ASMR, of course. We do very much like fiction here at the ASMR Municipal Library, and we really believe that getting absorbed in a story is a really great way to relax and just float away, get out of your head, get out of your life for a little while, and maybe live someone else's life, live in a different world, and help you relax and sometimes even fall asleep. Now, I recall from our phone conversation that you said you're interested in things like a bit of romance, a bit of adventure, a bit of fantasy, or alternate dimensions, other worlds, other planets, that sort of thing. And it seemed to me that what you are most motivated by in your reading is escaping from this level of reality and just reading stories that are quite realistic in the way that they play out, but also have an element of the spectacular or the unreal and the not quite 100% true to reality. You like an element of the fantastical, and you enjoy an element of suspended disbelief in your reading. So based on that, I have made some selections for what I think you might consider borrowing from the library and having a read of, if you do choose to sign up for a membership today. Now, would you be okay if I ran through those selections with you just now? Great. Okay, well, I think that I would like to start with one of the classics. So, you did say that you enjoyed a love story, and so I have gotten for you the greatest love story of all time. Now, have you read this? Well, you haven't. Oh, that's good. So this is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Now, this is one of the most famous and well-respected and widely read pieces of literature of all time, and it is actually one of my favourite stories of all time as well. I'm a big reader, and I did study literature at one time, and even so, having read all of these books, this remains one of the best stories I have ever read. In my opinion, it is the perfect love story and the perfect three-act story. So if you're familiar with the progression of a plot, the traditional progression of a plot would be ideally written much like a play in 3 acts, where the drama can be separated into 3 separate sections that escalate upon each other. And this is one of the best examples I've ever read of that structure. But that's not all it has going for it. Of course, it is an excellent romance. Now, if you're not familiar with the plot, I will tell you. Pride and Prejudice is set in Regency England in that period, and it's based around the Bennet family, which is a family of the gentry class. So they do have money, they certainly do not have to work, they have an estate, and there are 5 daughters. But of course, because of the laws at the time, the fact that there are no sons in the Bennet family means that once the patriarch, Mr. Bennet, dies, his estate will pass to a distant male relative, a male heir. So the 5 Bennet girls are all very much under the obligation to find a husband, because their parents will not be able to provide for them forever. The main character of the story is the second eldest daughter, Elizabeth Bennet, Lizzie Bennet, and she is not demonstrably occupied with husband hunting. She doesn't really rate men in general. She thinks that romance and the pursuit of romance is quite frivolous and silly, and she would prefer to have a lively conversation or read a book. But she meets some interesting characters in the form of the very famous Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, who are very, very rich men. And of course, Elizabeth is not looking for romance, and nor is Mr. Darcy, and they dislike each other intensely at first. Of course, you can imagine that this would not be the most famous love story of all time if they disliked each other intensely for the duration of the story, and they certainly don't. But what they must surmount is, of course, as a rich, haughty man who is quite reluctant to speak to people, particularly to people below his station, he certainly is the pride in this title, and Elizabeth herself is quite ill-disposed towards men who are very rich and put on airs and who are, uninterested in speaking to people below their station. And so she is somewhat prejudiced, or very prejudiced, against him being a rich man. Now, of course, like any good story, you can't just have two characters and you can't just have one plot point. So what's so great about Pride and Prejudice is there is also a lot of complexity going on around this particular part of the plot as well. You have other characters. You do have the 4 other Bennet sisters, two of whom are very, very important to the plot, and they get up to all kinds of difficult, sticky things that help to turn the story. There's also distant relatives who are quite instrumental to the plot, distant relatives both of the Bennets and of Mr. Darcy. And there's really, a whole host of characters and a whole host of things to consider in making this perfect plot drive forward and reach its amazing, wonderful set of conclusions. So I certainly recommend that book to you, and if you like a romance, this will be probably the best romance that I think you will ever read. Now, I'm firmly of the belief that there is absolutely nothing wrong or nothing inferior about a story that is chiefly romantically inclined. Romantic love is, after all, what makes the world go around, and it is one of the most universal experiences that we all will share at one point or another. But if you happen to not be in the mood for a romance today or at any point, I might take you right to the other end of the spectrum to a story which is quite different in nature, and this is one of the greatest pieces of fantasy or sci-fi ever written, and it is Dune by Frank Herbert. Now, this is the very, very first in the Dune series. Many books did come after, set in the Dune universe, but this is the original. I won't say the original and the best because I have not personally read any of the others, but some of the other books were written in collaboration with Frank Herbert's, I think, son. But this one was just written by Frank Herbert, and this is probably a good recommendation if you are a fan of Game of Thrones. Now, this is not entirely like Game of Thrones. I will tell you the premise is that you've had a noble house from one planet, let's presume that it's Earth, has been banished because of a feud, and they have been sent to rule a ghastly desert planet called Arrakis, which is basically covered in dunes, and it is inhabited by some people who are perfectly equipped to deal with the extreme desert environment, and they're a little bit like the Bedouins of our Earth. But the ruling family on Arrakis are very much put out by the fact that this foreign family has come and been put in place by a sort of higher power to rule on this planet. And so there is quite a lot of political and royal intrigue going on in this book. There is a lot of scheming and plotting and spying, and there is the family, there's blood feud to think about. There's also just a really interesting coming of age story at the center of it. The youngest member of the Atreides family, who have taken over Arrakis, is tasked with, or perhaps you could say thrown into, becoming intimately familiar with the several cultures which live on Arrakis, and let's say it's not the easiest thing becoming initiated into their ways and means. One of the interesting things that they deal with on Arrakis is that what would you call it, the subterranean layer is actually populated by giant, what's called sandworms, which are the most terrifying thing that you could probably imagine. And you may be able to call to mind this image of a giant worm emerging out of a sand dune, because it is kind of part of our popular consciousness, I think, because of a Dune film that was made in perhaps the 70s, but also I think there have been a couple of animated adaptations of Dune as well. So there's some really iconic imagery in here, but it's not just, you know, some sort of silly romp into a hostile planet with some, you know, big bad monsters. It's a very, very interesting story of royal intrigue, political intrigue, faction forming and breaking, and it's, you know, this is why I draw the comparison to Game of Thrones. You really have to follow whose alliance is with who and who's betraying who, and it's also a little bit philosophical, because of course some of the ways that you can cope with challenges in life is to take on a sort of sense of spirituality or philosophy about what's going on. So there's really a lot for everyone in Dune, and it is definitely a page turner. The prose is excellent, and you'll probably find yourself quite absorbed in it and unable to put it down right till the end, but it should occupy you for a while, because it's not the shortest book ever written, but it's also not prohibitively long, and I think that you'll find that the time just flies by. My next recommendation for you is also slightly along the lines of sci-fi, but this one I think you would more refer to as speculative fiction, spec-fic, and that is The Year of the Flood by Margaret Atwood. This is probably one of her most famous books, definitely her most famous of recent books. She's probably most famous for The Handmaid's Tale. Something that most of her books have in common is that they are set in a post-apocalyptic Earth, or a post kind of critical meltdown sort of situation, and this is certainly a post-apocalyptic novel. But what is so fascinating about it is that she doesn't really tell you at the beginning how the apocalyptic event happened, so you're actually spending quite a lot of the novel wondering, how did they get to where they're at? So what's going on in the book is that you've got one woman is living in a rooftop garden, and she's the only person who has survived this sort of apocalyptic event, and she suspects that it's possible that she is the only person who has survived this event. But there is another woman who was a exotic dancer, and she is trapped in a private room in the strip club where she worked. So she was in essence hermetically sealed and was protected from everything that went on, but of course I think the electricity is out and she cannot unlock the door where she is trapped. So one of the, I suppose, essential tensions in the novel is, will either of these women discover that they each exist and that there are actually humans who have survived and they're not alone? And the other question in the novel is, how did this come to be? How did all of this come to be? How did this one woman end up an exotic dancer when she's from quite a different background? And how did the other woman end up in this rooftop garden, which is part of a sort of a cult? And so how did she come to join the cult? And how did this apocalyptic situation then unfold? Why did it happen? How did it happen? One of the really interesting things about Margaret Atwood's work is that she's quite preoccupied with this idea that human activity will bring about some sort of near extinction level event for us, that we will do this to ourselves. So unless we, I suppose, take responsibility for the environment and for the planet that we live on. So on that note, it is a very interesting and cautionary sort of tale, and I think that she very, very intelligently addresses some points of human behaviour in this novel, but also characterises it very, very well. It's certainly not just a philosophical exploration of the folly of humankind. It's very much a plot-driven and character-driven story. So there's definitely plenty of meat on the bones of this, and so much to recommend it. And it's very easy to read also. So let's put that on your recommendations pile. Okay, now let's go to the other end of the scale. So from a future post-apocalyptic Earth to a possible imagining of the history of Earth, we have The Clan of the Cave Bear by Jean M. Orr. Now, this is an absolutely fascinating historical fiction which deals with some humans and Neanderthals in what is, I believe, called the Pleistocene or Pleistocene era. Basically, it's in prehistory. So back when Neanderthals were still roaming the earth. Where this book starts is with a 5-year-old Homo sapien called Ayla, and something very, very terrible happens to her whole family, and she is orphaned at such a young age, and she is stumbled upon and adopted by a clan of Neanderthals. So of course they find her very, very different and strange. Of course the differences in physiology were so different between the two species, but they certainly were not so far apart as not to understand each other, even if they had different ways of speaking. So what is so interesting about this story, or one of the things that's so great about it, is the meticulous research that the author has obviously done in order to be able to even write it or conceive it. So she has scoured the world and the libraries of the world to find out all sorts of things about what historical humans would have eaten, how they cooked what they ate, how they even knew what was good to eat, what their customs might have been, what their artwork was like, what they valued, how their families might have been structured, if they travelled, if they moved around, how did they merge families or clans, did they have comings together of large groups of them, all sorts of absolutely fascinating things. I don't know if you find anthropology that fascinating, but if you do, this will be just such a wonderful, wonderful book for you to read. And it's also very character driven. It's not just a list of historical facts. It certainly delves into the difficulties of being a human among Neanderthals, who really, they have quite different brains, and there are a couple of things that are very essentially different about them. And if you are a human and you are adopted by them at 5 years old, then you may well consider yourself one of them, but not really ever quite understand why you're so different from them, and why you sometimes struggle to communicate. And also the structure of the Neanderthal family that she is adopted into has its own sort of royal hierarchy, and she does definitely run across some very big challenges, and I suppose jealousy from the the next in line to rule the family, because of course she is such an impressive person, and she in many ways is a much better person than the Neanderthal who is set to inherit the family. So she definitely faces some absolutely enormous, sometimes heartbreaking challenges when it comes to trying to live with a clan who are really not her own, and it is the clan of the Cave Bear. She is cared for by a brother and sister who are the shaman and the medicine woman, so she does certainly have her allies, but ultimately this is a fascinating exploration about getting along as a species, but also getting along in prehistoric Earth as a human being. And the last one that I'm going to show you today is also set in Earth, but it is maybe a slightly enhanced version of Earth. So this one is by one of my favourite authors of all time. He's just spectacular. This is Neil Gaiman, and the book is called American Gods. Now this one is quite hard to explain. It's quite a complicated plot. So I'm just going to read to you for starters from the blurb. Shadow is a man with a past, but now he wants nothing more than to live a quiet life with his wife and stay out of trouble, until he learns that she's been killed in a terrible accident. And I should mention, they don't say this, but Shadow actually was in jail. Flying home for the funeral, as a violent storm rocks the plane, a strange man in the seat next to Shadow introduces himself. The man calls himself Mr. Wednesday, and he knows more about Shadow than is possible. He warns Shadow that a far bigger storm is coming, and from that moment on, nothing will ever be the same. Now that's something we hear quite often, nothing will ever be the same, but that's certainly true in this novel. And one of the interesting things that it questions is mythologies and pantheons, and gods and monsters and deities. Are they bound to the lands where they were first imagined, or do they travel when people migrate? For example, if you were believing in some Slavic gods in Central Europe, but your entire culture migrated to North America, would those gods follow you, or are they bound to the area where they were generated? And indeed, what happens? What happens if they do come with you? Do they become forgotten in their old land, and that sort of thing? And also, are they in any way real and human and manifest on the plane that humans can understand? Now, I think that you may already be getting some ideas about this novel, so I don't want to tell you too much, but I will tell you that it is also a little bit of a crime mystery. There's definitely a very important mystery at the centre of it to be solved. And there's also some interesting parallels to, I guess, religious stories and some of the more cataclysmic things that have happened in our religious myths, our worldwide religious myths. So if you're interested in mythology in general and mythologies of the world and gods, pantheons of gods, especially pantheons and belief systems that are no longer currently cleaved to, then I think this will be a very, very interesting story for you. It is also extremely readable, unputdownable. Neil Gaiman has this fabulous knack for just gripping you right from the first word, and you'll probably stay up all night and read it and be wondering what's going on the whole time. And you'll feel so satisfied at the end. But that will be for the best, because Neil Gaiman actually has many, many other books that he has written. You may be familiar with some of them. He wrote the Sandman series. He wrote the story that, if you've seen the movie Stardust, that's one of his. Coraline. There's a few others that have been made into TV or films as well. He's obviously definitely a very well respected author and very, very talented, and writes these excellent stories that are set in our reality but are definitely an enhanced, deepened, more esoteric sometimes version of our reality, and delve into the sorts of things that human beings have been wondering about since time immemorial, to wit, gods, and whether there is anything else out there, and if there is it the way that we imagine it to be? So this is such a fascinating story, and I definitely recommend that for you. Also, now I'm going to give you one bonus recommendation for today, because as we were talking about that, I thought of something that is also on the subject of gods and theology and human life, and I really must recommend it to you, because it is actually one of my favourite stories of all time. So this last recommendation I have for you, like I said, it is actually one of my favourite stories of all time, and it is a trilogy, but I just have the first book here. This is his Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. Now this is the first book. It's called Northern Lights, and it's the UK title. He is from the UK, but I believe in America and possibly some other countries it was released under the name The Golden Compass, and you may recognise that because it was also made into a film a few years ago starring Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig, James Bond. And this is one of the most extraordinary trilogies that I have ever read. It doesn't really sound like much when you read the blurb. It doesn't sound very original. It just says here, Lyra Belacroix and her animal demon, which is a sort of an animal spirit that is attached to every human, live half wild and carefree among the scholars of Jordan College, Oxford. The destiny that awaits her will take her to the frozen lands of the Arctic, where witch clans reign and ice bears fight. Her extraordinary journey will have immeasurable consequences far beyond her own world. Now that's a little hint at what goes on in the rest of the story. Now what we have here is an excellent adventure story with quite a young girl at its centre. She's a very, very plucky, very confident, very interesting young girl who really faces up to some challenges that I think even some adults would be terrified by. And she has some very, very serious things to fight at the hands of adults, and it is, as you heard, quite fantastical. You have your ice bears and witches. You also have the slightly important matter of a alternate dimension of our world, and a way of hopping through from one dimension to the other, and the potential chaos that can cause. But all of this sounds like fairly standard fantasy fare. But what is very unique about his Dark Materials is how extraordinarily philosophical it is. It's very much preoccupied with the idea of the soul and of original sin, the concept of growing up from childhood into adulthood and the loss of innocence. It's preoccupied with the idea of God or gods, and as you can see, it's really very hard to explain in a succinct way, but suffice it to say that if you do choose to read it, you will scarce be able to put it down, and I think you will find it very, very interesting, as well as very, very entertaining. It's an excellent adventure and some truly extraordinary characters, and some very original ideas as well. And it is written for a YA audience, I believe. I mean, I think maybe that was the publisher's decision, but you can certainly tell by reading it that it is perfectly fine for adults. I was introduced to this book when I was about 22 or 23, and I certainly did not feel like it was aimed at a very young audience. It definitely felt sufficiently adult for me. Sometimes, at times, maybe too adult, too complicated, or at least too complicated for children. I would certainly recommend this at your age as well as any other. So that's the selection of books that I have for you today. You are of course welcome to come back in any other time and browse our selection, or indeed you are welcome to browse it right now. Or alternately, you could simply check out the books that I have recommended for you today. I have taken the liberty of setting you up partially with the membership, and I have a membership card ready for you. Just will need you to sign it, and then we can book you out these books today. Would you like to do that? Excellent. All right, well, let's just get you processed, and then you'll be on your way with these books. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming in and talking to us today. We certainly appreciate any interest in the ASMR Municipal Library, and we do hope that you enjoy your stories and that you come again soon.